Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Merrin. I am a Northeast Regional Board Member of American Friends of Hebrew University, the US-based nonprofit organization that raises funds and awareness for the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And we welcome all of those who are tuning in from all around the globe. The reason why we're doing this series is obvious to most of us. Every day we see the tremendous amount of false and incomplete information and lies that are being spread about October 7th and the current war that is fueling a frightening increase in anti-Semitic sentiment and incidents. Separating fact from fiction is challenging in today's world, and specifically in this current Hamas-Israeli conflict. All of us need to understand the history and the facts to be able to educate and debate the issues with those of us who have not taken the time or energy to educate themselves. In addition, it's important for all of us to understand how Hamas, the Palestinians, and the Arab Muslim world perceive this conflict. During these extraordinary and difficult days, we are fortunate and deeply grateful to have experts from the Hebrew University teach us and equip us to teach others. So now let me turn this over to Shai Yosipov, and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. My name is Shai Yosipov. I work for the Hebrew University's Division of Advancement and External Relations, and I am very happy to introduce to you our speaker for Dr. Leo Lers. Dr. Lers is a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations and the Swiss Center for Conflict Research at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research interests include conflicts, peacemaking, diplomacy, and mediation, and he has worked on various topics within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as other conflict zones. Dr. Lers was a postdoctoral fellow at NYU and a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University. His book, titled Unofficial Peace Diplomacy, was published in 2022 by Manchester University Press. Dr. Lers, thank you very much for giving us your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Shai. It's great to be here, and thank you all of you for joining us in this event. I will just share screen. Okay, so thank you again for all of you for joining us today. And I know that maybe to talk about peacemaking these days sounds a little bit like science fiction, but I would like to take you today to a journey into the history of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the rise and the fall. And actually my presentation will have 4 parts before we will start discussion and Q&A. I will start with a short background leading to the development of the peace process, especially at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. And then I will talk about the Oslo Accords, the Oslo process during the 90s. And then in the third part, I will talk about the final status talks, what we call the Camp David process, and then the collapse of the process and leading to the second Intifada. And in the last part, I will talk a little bit about what happened after the collapse of the process, and especially about another efforts to reach an agreement in what we call the Annapolis process in 2008, and also the long stalemate that we have since then, actually until today. And let me start with a few words about the main developments and the main condition that eventually enabled and led to the development of the peace negotiation between Israel and the PLO, which were Israel and the Palestinians. And we need to go back to the end of the 80s, to the end of 87, December 87, with the eruption of the first Intifada that actually started in Gaza and moved later on to West Bank and East Jerusalem. And it happened 20 years after Israel got control over these areas, West Bank and the West Bank and Gaza in 67. And it's important to remember that at that point it was full Israeli control. There was no Palestinian Authority. It happened only after the Oslo agreement. And it's also important to remember that it was a different Intifada than the second Intifada that we had in 2000. The first Intifada was mainly protests and riots and violence of Palestinians, many young Palestinians, against Israeli soldiers in Palestinian areas, in the cities and villages. The second Intifada in 2000, that was actually mainly terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians inside Israeli cities in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and many others. So it was a very different kind of what we call an Intifada. But this intifada actually had a dramatic impact, and it actually reshaped the landscape of the conflict in different aspects. And I will just mention a few important developments. First of all, in July 88, Jordan declared a very important declaration saying that they are disengaging from the West Bank. They don't have any claim whatsoever in the West Bank. And as we all know, Jordan controlled the West Bank until 1967. And for many years, during the 70s, during the 80s, different Israeli politicians, decision makers, talked about the Jordanian option, that one day, if there will be an agreement about the West Bank, it will be with Jordan, negotiated with Jordan, not with the PLO, because Israel refused during these years to talk with the PLO, of course, the Palestine Liberation Organization, because they consider them as a terrorist organization. And as we all know, they conducted terrible, horrific terrorist attacks, especially during the 70s. We remember the Munich Olympic game and Ma'alot and other cases leading also later on also to the 80s. That's why Israel, some Israeli politicians prefer the option of Jordan. But here in this declaration in 88, Jordan said, no, we can't speak for the name of the Palestinians. Over the years, the PLO became the main and the leading representative of the Palestinian people, getting international legitimacy. So Jordan at that point said, Israel, if you want to talk about the West Bank, you need to negotiate with the Palestinians, not with us. So that was an important development because Jordanian option is off the table. Another important development took place at the end of 88, in November 88, when the PLO, again, the Palestine Liberation Organization, had a big gathering, a big conference in Algeria, and they declared publicly and formally for the first time that they accept the two-state solution. And that was actually the end of a very long internal debate inside the PLO. And this is something I've been working a lot in my research about what should be the strategy of the PLO. When, of course, the original position of the PLO in the 60s, in the 70s, was one secular state. And this is a slogan that we hear today, from the river to the sea. That was the original position of the PLO, and focusing on military strategy. But over the years, slowly they moved to a different position, accepting the idea of the two-state solution and moving from military to political strategy. And 88 was actually the end game of this process, when formally they accepted the two-state solution. And they actually accepted what we call 181, the partition plan that was presented many years ago. It was rejected by the Palestinians, the Arabs in 47. Now they accepted the idea of partition. And in the end of 88, in December, Arafat, that was the leader of the PLO, went even a step further and accepted the precondition that the US raised and other international actors over the years, saying the PLO, if you want to be part of the peace process, you need to accept the existence of Israel. You need to accept the 242 UN resolution that is talking about land for peace, and also to renounce terrorism. And actually, at the end of 88, the PLO for the first time agreed to these conditions. Based on that, for the first time, there was a formal dialogue between the United States. It was the last days of Reagan administration and the PLO. But at that point, Israel still refused to talk with the PLO. But it's important to say that the first intifada, again, that lasted for a few years, actually had a dramatic impact on the Israeli public, because the issue of the West Bank and Gaza was not a major issue in the Israeli public opinion, public debate, political debate. If you remember, during the 80s, it was more about Lebanon. And suddenly, this explosion actually raised more and more debate and question in the public of what are we going to do there, what is the end game for this area in the conflict, or whether we should talk with the Palestinian. And we can see also more and more support among the Israeli public with the idea of talking with the Palestinian about some kind of a model, some kind of solution for this issue. And we can also see during these years growing international attention to the question of the West Bank and Gaza with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was not the focus before that during the 80s. But that was not enough to push the parties to negotiate. It took a few years with a very important development that happened at the beginning of the 90s. First of all, of course, we need to remember there was a global changes at the beginning of the 90s with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I'm dealing in my research with peace studies and peacemaking and conflict around the world in different areas. And you can see that actually this global development changed many conflict zones and created much better conditions to start peacemaking processes in different places in Africa, in Latin America, in Northern Ireland, but also in the Middle East. So this is already an important development. And if you remember another important development in the region, it's also the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait, if you remember, leading to an international coalition led by the United States to stop him and actually to force him to get out of Kuwait. And this is an important development with implication on the conflict because of two reasons. First of all, it was a war for the first time. Most of the wars in the Middle East was Israelis against Arab countries in 48, in 67, in 73. This was actually a war when Israel found itself with other Arab countries in the same side, like Syria, like Egypt, like the Gulf states. And it seems that the Middle East is actually changing. It's not just Israel against the Arabs. And another important implication is concerning the Palestinian side. When PLO and Arafat actually did a terrible mistake, I think one of the worst mistakes they did, decided to support Saddam Hussein in this war. As a result of that, they became isolated around the world. And more important, the Gulf states, and especially the Saudis that supported the PLO, supported the Palestinian, decided to stop this support, leading to a very difficult crisis among the PLO, and also expelling a lot of Palestinian workers in the Gulf states that were expelled because of the PLO supporting Saddam Hussein. And that was, I think, one of the worst moments of crisis for the PLO. And another layer of this crisis is also because suddenly the PLO found that in the competition with another actor in the Palestinian sphere. If for many years it was only the PLO as maybe the only actor in the Palestinian political sphere, suddenly at the end of the 80s, 87, 88, during the first years of the Intifada, you have a new actor. And this is, of course, the Hamas movement that was created and started to challenge the PLO, started to compete with the PLO on who will be the leaders of the Palestinian people. And that was a big concern for the PLO. Now, next week, you have another session with Professor Avigal Jacobson, more to discuss about Hamas, but I will mention that two main differences. First of all, Hamas is a much more religious movement compared to the PLO that is much more secular. And another important difference is while the PLO was starting to talk about the two-state solution during the end of the 80s, the Hamas published the convention and talking about no option of any compromise with Israel or with the Jews, talking about a holy war, talking about a holy land. There was no place for any compromise, nothing but a Palestinian Islamic state. So we can already see the differences in this competition that will continue, as we know, for many, many years. But that was a concern for the PLO. And this moment of crisis actually pushed them to look for a political way, for a political process with Israel and with the international community to bring some achievement to the public. And it's also relevant from the Israeli context because more and more Israelis saw this that the Hamas is getting stronger. Suddenly you have another actor, not just the PLO. And even though Israel had a lot of problems and challenges with the PLO, the option of Hamas is much worse because many people thought with Hamas we don't have any option for dialogue. It's a holy war, it's a holy conflict, it's a religious conflict. There is no option for a solution. With the PLO, at least we can negotiate. Shimon Peres, by the way, that was back then an important leader of the Labour Party, he always said that I don't love the PLO, but when I'm looking on Hamas as the alternative, I became romantic because suddenly I'm thinking about the two options. I need to decide if we are not going to have a negotiation with the PLO, we found ourselves with Hamas, and that will be just an unending conflict forever. And that pushed the parties to think more and more about negotiation. And then just another important development was, of course, the Madrid conference, when James Baker, Secretary of State, I think a very impressive Secretary of State, was able to have a shuttle diplomacy, I think like Blinken is doing today, and trying to force all the parties to sit together in Madrid, trying to create a new political order in the Middle East, and actually bring in Israel, Syria, Jordan, the Palestinian, Lebanon, to sit together and to start a multi-track negotiation for the first time. And eventually there was no real progress when Yitzhak Shamir was still the prime minister during these years, 91, 92. But there was another important development, and this is the last important factor in this transition. And this is the political change that happened in Israel in 92, when Yitzhak Rabin, that was the leader of the Labour Party, won a big victory of election in 92, creating a Labour Party government. When Rabin, of course, was very popular back then, had a wide legitimacy because he came from the military. He was, of course, the IDF chief of staff in '67 war. And he was talking already in the election campaign about the option of an agreement with the Palestinian about autonomy and talking about separation between the two people. That was part of his election campaign. And as we can see, a short time after that, during 93, for the first time, Israel and the PLO will start negotiating, first secretly in Oslo. That is also a fascinating story for scholars on this issue of negotiation and peacemaking, and eventually reaching the agreement of Oslo that I will talk in a minute. But again, this is for everybody that is dealing with conflict and peace processes around the world, this is a fascinating case study. And seeing this picture that you can see here, the handshake between Rabin and Arafat, and I'm teaching the course or courses on the history of the conflict. For many, many years, nobody thought it could happen. We know that it was only the first step, but the fact that you have Israel and the PLO that refused to recognize one another. Israel saw the PLO as the worst terrorist organization that we will never talk with, and the PLO, of course, wanted the destruction of Israel. And they get to a point, and this is a fascinating analysis to see how it happened, reaching to the point that they actually agreed and started the peacemaking process and what we call the Oslo process. And of course, this happened in the White House. Now we are getting to the Oslo process and the Oslo Accord. Let me just say a few words about it, because everybody, of course, is using the words of Oslo as part of the internal Israeli debate, in Palestinian debate, international debate. I'm not sure if everybody knows exactly the details, but let me just say a few words about this agreement, and actually a few agreements at the Oslo Accords. First of all, the first Oslo Accord in 93, it's important to say that a very major element that was in this agreement, and I think that with all the problem and the challenges, this is something that we can't deny, is the mutual recognition that took place between Israel and the PLO. And this is something that happened actually a few days before the agreement. It was an exchange of letters between Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, that was the head of the PLO. You can Google it, you can see the document, it's very short, in which the PLO formally recognized the state of Israel, and not just the state of Israel, but also its right to exist and to live in peace and security. That was the precondition of Israel to sign the agreement with the PLO, that the PLO will formally recognize it. And back then, that was a very important also for Israel, for the Israel international status, that the PLO and Arafat actually recognized formally the state of Israel and its right to exist and live in peace and security. And as a result of that, Rabin recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. And that was another important step, because we know that recognition is always an important step when we are talking about conflict resolution. And in Oslo itself, it's also important, talking about the Oslo first agreement in September 93, that was not a final status agreement, and it was not a peace agreement like we signed with Jordan and we signed with Egypt. That was an interim agreement for 5 years. Actually, it was a temporary agreement that was supposed to be from 94 until 99. And the main idea behind it is that this is a very complicated conflict. In the literature, we call it intractable conflict. It's one of the most complicated and violence and related to identity and related to religion and identity and emotions. So this is a very, very complex conflict with long years and generation after generation. So it will be impossible to solve it just in one step. That's why the main idea of Oslo, and by the way, it was discussed already between Begin and Sadat before that, that we need to think about 2 stages, what Kissinger called step by step. Let's start with the first step. That will be the Oslo Agreement, just an interim agreement for 5 years. And in these years, we will create a Palestinian Authority. Again, before that, there was no Palestinian Authority, only Israeli control. So that will be the first step, and the Palestinians can control themselves, at least their civil life of the Palestinian in the West Bank, in Gaza. And based on that, Israelis and Palestinians will start working together. Hopefully, there will build trust. And then during these years, they need to negotiate what we call the final status agreement. That will be the peace agreement. And here and there, we will deal with the most complicated, most sensitive issues. And of course, the 4 main core issues are Jerusalem and refugees. That's the most sensitive, complicated issues, but also security and borders, including, of course, the question of a Palestinian state and the question of the settlement. And the decision was, let's postpone it for the next stage. We can't deal with it that right now. We are just starting the process. We are just at the beginning of the process. Let's postpone it to the next stage and agree on just on the interim agreement. And of course, the problem here is that we actually found ourselves in a situation that we couldn't move to the next stage. As you know, even though the deadline was 99, we never were able to reach an agreement until today. So this temporary agreement actually lasted for 30 years. And we are stuck in a situation that we don't want to withdraw back, and we can reach an agreement further. So we are stuck in a situation that was supposed to be temporary. So this is something that's important to remember talking about the Oslo agreement. And during the 90s, we will see slowly the implementation of this agreement. First of all, of course, the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, again, that was not exist before that. And it started only in Gaza and Jericho. And Jericho is a city in the West Bank, very close to the border with Jordan. And for the first time, also the creation of a Palestinian police, the Palestinian security forces, not an army, but a police that's supposed to deal mainly with internal security problems. This is also for the first time in the history. Another important element in Oslo was the security cooperation, the issue that we are still dealing with today in the West Bank, of keeping the cooperation, the coordination between the parties. And during these years, we will see the transfer of responsibility moving from Israel and the Israeli army and what we call civil administration, the Minhal Ezrachi, to the Palestinian Authority, that they will now manage the issues of health, they will manage the issue of education and religion and municipal issues and all the civil life of the Palestinian in the West Bank, in Gaza. By the way, not in East Jerusalem, because again, that's an issue for the final status agreement. But that's the main idea, to start, again, the first steps and creation of the Palestinian Authority. Another important point talking about the Oslo process during these years is that the relation of Israel with different Arab countries really changed because of Oslo. Because some Arab countries said, we are not going to be holier than the Pope. If Yasser Arafat, if the PLO is now recognizing Israel's right to exist and in peace and security, it means that we can also start formal relation. And we can see during these years that the leaders of Israel were in Paris for visiting Morocco and Oman and Bahrain, and started relation, even a secret relation with the UAE, and also opened an office in the Tunisia and others. So that was an important development also in the Oslo process. But the most important development in this context is the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan. And this is actually the second peace agreement that we had in the history after peace with Egypt. And it's important to say that King of Jordan, Hussein, back then, wanted to do peace with Israel for many, many years. That was his dream. Israel and Jordan always had secretly very good relation. But it was difficult for Jordan to do that until there will be a progress between Israel and the Palestinian. And once Oslo Accord was signed and the mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO, the Jordanian king gave a green light and started negotiation peace, especially with Rabin, eventually signing the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan in 94. So that was another result of this process. And there was also discussion back then about the economic integration. If you remember, Shimon Peres was talking about the new Middle East, and there were different regional economic summits around the Middle East, in Morocco, in Amman, in Jordan, and others. But as we know, later on, once the process got into more and more political crisis, it also stopped the economic process. But there were many hopes and many dreams back then. And the second Oslo agreement that Rabin actually signed short time before he was murdered, and it was signed in September 95, again in the White House. That was an agreement that actually created a new map of the West Bank. And you will see it here in the map. And this is again actually the map that exists until today. That was supposed to be just a new area, a new map just for 5 years, something like until 99. And I interviewed many people who negotiated this agreement. They said, we just thought it will be just for a few months. We never realized that will be the situation for so many years. But this is actually the map that exists for 30 years, because this is still the map of Oslo. I will just explain what we can see here. So this is what we call Area A, B, and C. Area A that you can see here in green, it's actually the Palestinian main cities in the West Bank, Ramallah, Jenin, Tulkarem. It's something like 18% of the West Bank. And there is a full Palestinian control, security and civil control in this area of the Palestinian Authority. Areas B that you will see here in orange, it's actually all the Palestinian villages in the West Bank, and there is a joint control. It means Palestinian control the civil life, the civil aspect, and Israel control the security aspect. Sometimes it's a joint Israeli-Palestinian security, sometimes it's mainly Israel, it depends, of course, when. but that was the main idea of Area B. And Area C, it's actually 60% of this area, of the West Bank, it's all the West. And there it's a full Israeli control, and all the settlement are in Area C. And this is another important element in Oslo. The idea was, let's talk about the settlement in the final status negotiation. Meanwhile, we are not going to touch, we are not going to do anything with the settlement. It will stay where it is. That was also a way of Rabin and Peres to get public support, to say we are not evacuating any settlement now. We will talk about it in the future. So it means that the settlement will stay, and that will be part of Area C. And this is, of course, an issue to negotiate later on in the final status negotiation. About Gaza, it's important to say that Israel, of course, as part of Oslo, evacuated most of the Gaza Strip, but there are still the areas of the settlement that was still there, as you know, until Sharon will decide to evacuate them many years after that. But during Oslo, it was still there, the settlement. You will see here the Gush Katif, the settlement of Netzarim, and here in the north. And the decision again was that they will stay there until the final status agreement. And it created, of course, a lot of challenges looking on the security aspect, because like Netzarim, for example, is in the middle of Gaza, in the middle of 2 million Palestinians. You have a lot of frictions and problem with the Palestinian Authority, and you need to have some security arrangement. And that was a big challenge, but that was the decision in Oslo, not to change the status of the settlement at this point. And I'll just mention another important part, and this is for the fact that after this agreement, you have for the first time an election for the Palestinian Authority, election for the president, and election for the parliament for the first time in the history. And back then, it was only the movement of Arafat, the movement of what we call Fatah. It's the main movement in the PLO. And Hamas decided to boycott the election because Hamas, and I will get to it in a minute, of course, was against the Oslo agreements, against recognizing with Israel, and they claimed that Arafat is a traitor by even doing this agreement, and they refused to participate in the election because it's based on Oslo. We know that later on, again, a decade after that, they will decide to participate, but in this election, they decide not to participate. We can also need to take under consideration the fact that the support in Hamas back then was quite low, and the support in Arafat and the PLO back then, especially because of Oslo, was much higher. So they probably know that they will probably lose, but they didn't participate in the election. Arafat and Fatah had a big victory in this election. And as I mentioned, of course, Hamas was against this movement, but it's not just that it was against it, it will try to do whatever it can to stop the process. Now, in my field of conflict and peace studies, there is the important concept of the peace spoilers. And this is something we can see in different conflicts around the world. And when you have actors, organizations that see the option of peace or peacemaking or peace agreement as a threat, as a big threat for them, for their identity, for their goals, and they will do whatever they can and use whatever tools they have, mainly violent, in order to stop the process and to prevent the process. And you can see in many studies in this field, scholars are using the case of Hamas as one of the best examples for peace spoilers in the case of Oslo, because during these years, you will see terrible, horrific terrorist attacks against Israelis inside Israel in cities like Tel Aviv, like Jerusalem. During the Oslo years, I mentioned some of the cases like Dizengoff in 94, suicide bombing in 95 in Bet Lid, 96 in Jerusalem. It was in bus 18 in 1 week. They actually did twice in the same bus. I can say in a personal note that was actually my bus to school. I was living in Jerusalem, so I remember it very good. But that actually created a lot of fear and actually had a direct impact on the Israeli public opinion. People started to lose support and confidence in the process because they saw that there is no security. That was the goal also of Hamas. Even though the government tried to say they are trying to stop the process, we did the process with the PLO. That's the goal to change the situation, but it's important to say that it had an influence on the Israeli public. You can see here some of the data during these years. At the same time, there was also Israeli spoilers that tried to stop and tried to prevent the process. The two most important cases are, first of all, the case in 94, a short time after Oslo was signed, when an extremist settler, Baruch Goldstein, went into the holy site in Hebron, the Marat HaMachpelah, the Cave of the Patriarch, and killed many Palestinians, with a clear goal to end the process. He was also from the movement of Kahan Chai, the movement of Kach, a very extreme right-wing movement. And of course, in November 95, as you know, the Prime Minister Rabin was murdered, was assassinated at the end of a big protest, a big demonstration supporting peace. He was killed by, and again, an extreme right-wing Yigal Amir that wanted to stop the process. So we saw spoilers that try and actually were very successful in trying to change and to stop the process that was already started. And just to complete the 90s, I will mention that in 96, there were elections when after Rabin was killed, Peres replaced him and ran against Netanyahu. That was the first time Netanyahu was running as the head of the Likud. And it was eventually very, very close, but Netanyahu won. And an important factor was the terrorist attack during 96 that actually changed the public opinion and influenced them to get less support in the peace process, and was very helpful eventually to change the political landscape in Israel. And another important point is that during these years, Netanyahu was, of course, against Oslo as a head of the opposition, but he was forced to continue. There was a lot of pressure from Clinton administration, but it continued very, very slowly with a lot of problems and crises and challenges. And the main topic that we will see during these years as a source of content and a source of tension between Israel and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority was the question of expansion of the settlement. That was already back then an issue, and that actually was something that changed the Palestinian public, that started to less and less support the peace process, because they were asking why, if we are talking about the option of two states, why we have more and more settlements. So this is another thing that happened during these years and was another source of tension between the parties, even though the process actually continued and there was still agreement in 97 and 98. And it will bring us actually to the peak moment in the process, but also the collapse of the process in the year 2000. And if you remember, I mentioned that the deadline in Oslo was 99. Until May 99, the parties need to have a final peace agreement, a final status agreement. But as we all know, eventually they started the negotiation only after 99. For the first time, they only started the negotiation in 2000. It happened only after another political change in Israel. We have many political changes during the 90s, and that was Ehud Barak, that was the prime minister that was elected in 99, again from the Labour Party, and Netanyahu lost in 99. And Barak promised to bring peace with Syria and with the Palestinian. As we know, both of them eventually didn't happen. But during 2000, the parties started for the first time negotiation on the most sensitive issues. Again, the four core issues and all the other issues: the borders, the refugees, Jerusalem, and security. And in the summer 2000, as you can see here in a very famous picture, President Clinton decided to invite the parties to Camp David to try to do what President Carter did successfully in 78, and to try to bring them, to push them to try to reach a final status agreement. It was mainly the idea of Barak. Barak thought that we need to force Arafat to have a final decision, not to continue the process for many years. Actually, Arafat said that he was not prepared, that the parties are not ready, but eventually accepted the invitation. And in Camp David, and this is a topic I've been working on a lot, I interviewed many of the people that participate. They made a progress on some of the issues, but as we all know, they didn't reach an agreement. And I can say that there are many problems, many disagreements, but eventually the main obstacle was the question of Jerusalem, and more specifically, the question of the holy sites and what the Jewish side call the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, and the Palestinian, the Muslim side will call Al-Aqsa, Haram al-Sharif. That was a red line for both sides. What will be the sovereignty? Who will have the sovereignty in this area? That was eventually the main obstacle for the negotiation. There were also many problems in the way the negotiation was conducted, the way that the mediation was conducted. There are a lot of literature and books on this issue, especially when we are comparing it to 78, when the American mediation was much more prepared, much more successful, but this is a specific issue. But what we all know that they didn't reach an agreement, and short time after that, in the end of September 2000, we can see the explosion again with the beginning of the second Intifada. It started after, the trigger was the visit of Ariel Sharon, that back then was the head of the opposition, in Al-Aqsa. It started with, again, in Jerusalem, in Al-Aqsa, but moved to Gaza and the West Bank, and actually continued for many years. The main escalation actually took time. It happened later in 2001, 2002. It was the worst year with terrible terrorist attacks, but it started already there. I will just mention that the peacemaking and the negotiation actually continued despite the Intifada. When Barak was still prime minister. He was prime minister until the beginning of 2001, until the election. And I will just mention another maybe last minute effort of President Clinton. And I must say that I think that Clinton was the American president that the most devoted to the issue of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think much more than the other president. And he also felt, again, according to interviews I did with people close to him, he felt that he had obligation to continue the legacy of Yitzhak Rabin that was murdered. And even a few days before he's leaving the White House, he said, let's try just one last minute efforts. And he tried to draft what we call the Clinton Plan, one of the most, I think, famous documents in the conflict. You can, again, Google it. That was a way to try to suggest some kind of a compromise solution for all the most complicated issues, try to reflect the long negotiation that took place. It came to the parties, it said, now you have a week to say yes or no. If we will say yes, we can move on to sign the agreement. And eventually, as we know, it didn't lead to breakthrough. Israel government, that was already at the end of before the election, but they said yes with some reservation. The Palestinians didn't give a clear answer, not yes or not no. And that was the end of the story. That was the end of the process. There was another meeting in Taba in 2001, really at the beginning, but if that was clear, this is the end, and we don't know when we will go back to this process at that point. And after that, again, Sharon was elected, again, from the Likud, the head of the Likud, 2001. And then we get into one of the worst, until October 7, terrible round of violence. 2001, 2002, a terrible terrorist attack inside Israeli city. Again, I was living in Jerusalem. I remember it's very good. I was trying to stay away from the center of Jerusalem for 2 years. And as a result, also military operation in the West Bank and in Gaza. And it seems that everything that was built in Oslo is actually starting to collapse. And during these years, nobody was talking about the option of peacemaking or talking about a final status agreement. And just to complete this part, I will just, it's important to say that everybody agreed that it was eventually failed and it was the end of the process until at this stage. But it's important to say that Israelis and Palestinians see it very, very differently. Of course, we know that. So it's important for me just to mention the narratives on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side about the collapse of the process and how they see that. So first of all, very briefly, the Israeli narrative, again, I'm not getting to if it's true or not, but this is the main argument that usually you will hear in the public opinion, and then I will talk about the Palestinians, is that the goal of Oslo was to get more security, but that was not the result. We got the violence continue, the terrorism continues, so we hope for security, but it's not something that we achieved, at least not at the first years of Oslo. Another important argument is against Arafat, that Arafat failed to transform himself from being a terrorist, the head of the organization, into a statesman, and he was ambivalent toward violence, making an agreement, but also sometimes giving a green light to violence, and never tried to prepare the public seriously for peace, like Sadat did, for example, and continued to use some incitement. The Israeli argument is also that the limitation that we saw on free movement, especially also during the second Intifada, with what we call the security fence or the separation wall, was mainly in order to prevent terrorist attacks to come inside Israel, as we saw during these years. Another argument is that as a result of Oslo, the Palestinian, most of them, 90% of them in the West Bank and Gaza, actually control themselves. The Palestinian Authority actually control their life. And of course, the criticism of Israel against the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is that they are corrupt, they are not democratic. And the main narratives that we hear in the Israeli public that really change also the political landscape, you can see that very clearly in the last 20 years, is that in Camp David we discovered that there is no partner. Again, without saying if it's true or not, I can elaborate on that in the Q&A. And also saying that even the Clinton blamed Arafat for this failure. And I will just say, you can see here in what we call the Peace Index, it's a public service that is being done every month. You can see that in the end of the 90s, there was almost 60% among the public opinion that felt that Oslo would bring peace, supporting the Oslo process. And after 2 years of the Intifada, you can see that it dropped declined into less than 20% that thought that Oslo can bring peace. So it was a completely dramatic change in the public opinion. Now, at the same time, we can see the mirror image of the Palestinian side. Again, both sides were disappointing and thought that we try and it failed, but from different reasons, from different narratives. In the Palestinian side, the main point is that our goal in Oslo was independence and to have a Palestinian state, and that was not the result. We didn't get a state, and actually it was just occupation of a different way. This is the Palestinian perspective. A major important criticism, of course, of Oslo from the Palestinian public against the leadership back then was the settlement expansion. They said if we are talking about two states, why we will see more and more settlement. You saw the data before that, and also land confiscation and closure and checkpoints. So this is actually the mirror image of the Israeli narrative. There were also a lot of promises doing Oslo, like building an airport and safe passage between the West Bank and Gaza, and redeployment of forces that eventually didn't happen. And from the Palestinian perspective, Camp David summit was actually a way of Israel and the US to try to push them to try with using ultimatum and giving them an unacceptable offer, especially on the question of Jerusalem. Again, mirror image comparing to Israel, claiming that also the Palestinian made some kind of a compromise on some of the issues. About the Intifada, the Palestinian narrative is that was the trigger for that was the provocative visit of Ariel Sharon to Al-Aqsa in the end of September 2000, and it was not something that was planned. It was really a public reaction to this visit. And about Clinton and about the US, the Palestinian argument is that the US actually showed that they are not an honest broker, they were not neutral mediator. And again, this is part, and there are many articles and literature about the different narrative and what we call the Reshumon, about how the different parties can agree that it failed, but they have, of course, different explanations. And just in the last part, before we will get to discussion and to the Q&A, I would like to say just a few words about what happened after the process collapsed. And next week, you will have another session also with Professor Abigail Jacobson that will talk more about the role of Hamas in the context of the collapse of the peace process and about the relation between Israel, Hamas, and the PA. That is, of course, very relevant for our situation today. But I will just say that there was another important, serious effort to try to reach an agreement that took place a few years after that in 2008. And it was a different leaders, Ehud Olmert on the Israeli side, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas on the Palestinian side, in what we call the Annapolis process, because it started with the Annapolis conference. And in between these two cases in 2000 and 2008, of course, in the first years, nobody was talking about peace, and both Sharon and Bush back then said that Arafat is not a partner for negotiation, so actually the peace process was frozen, and there were no final status talks. But then there were few developments that enabled to bring back the peace negotiation, when first of all, there was a political change on the Palestinian side. When Abu Mazen was elected after Arafat died, there was another election just for the head of the Palestinian Authority in 2005. Hamas, by the way, did not participate in this election. It was Abu Mazen against others that are not from Hamas. And he had a big victory. And it's important to say that even though Israel has a lot of problems and criticism on Abu Mazen, when we are talking about attitude toward violence, Abu Mazen was very different from Arafat. He was against the second Intifada. He was against terrorism. He was saying that publicly, and he changed completely the policy of the Palestinian Authority. And that actually started more and more cooperation, security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority from 2005 to end the violence, to end the Intifada, and to move on to a new direction. And another, of course, important factor and important developments is what you will talk more next week, the disengagement from Gaza. That was the decision of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon that decided to have a unilateral disengagement from Gaza, not part of a negotiation, not part of an agreement, and to evacuate all the settlement you can see here in the photo, all the settlement that were there in Gaza, and most of it was already Palestinian areas, but now also evacuating the settlement. What is important for our discussion is that the way it was perceived in the Palestinian side was that this is actually a victory for the violence and victory for what the Palestinians called the Mukarama, the resistance, and Hamas actually used it in a way as part of his campaign when he decided in 2006 to run for election. to say you didn't get anything from Oslo, but we because of us, because of our terrorism and violence, Israel left and evacuated the settlement. And because of that, in 2006, it was very helpful for them to win the election. And that was, of course, a dramatic change as part of this competition between Hamas and Fatah. And what happened next in 2007, that Hamas took over, using, of course, violence, took over of Gaza. And we saw something like a small civil war between Palestinians and Palestinians. We saw, by the way, the brutality of that we see from Hamas against their own people, killing some of the Palestinians from the Palestinian Authority, supporting of Abu Mazen, supporting of Fatah, also throwing people from the roof. And many of the Palestinians from the Palestinian Authority and Fatah actually ran away to the border that Israel will save them, running away from Hamas. So we saw that Hamas can use this kind of tool, this kind of policy, even against the people from their own people, from the Palestinian Authority. And it created a split that we have since then for many, many years until today, that you have one government of Palestinian government in Gaza, one government of Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, and they are also in conflict, an internal conflict. There were different efforts to try to bring an agreement between them, to talk about trying again to go back to be one entity, to have another election. There has been no election since then for so many years, but they couldn't reach an agreement. So we have actually another obstacle, that you have an internal conflict inside the Palestinian, that you have Hamas controlling here and Abu Mazen controlling here. And again, like in 93, it pushed the parties to try again and to have another round of negotiation. And this is what we call the Annapolis process. And I will just very, very briefly mention some of the issue, and then we can talk more about it in the Q&A. As we know, the parties did not reach an agreement, and Olmert resigned because of his trial and because of his corruption. But I will just talk briefly about some of the agreement and disagreement that maybe they get closer on some of the issues. And again, we can open it later for questions. First, the issue of borders. The parties agreed that there will be two states, and Israel will withdraw from most of the West Bank. But there was some disagreement about the percentage. And the parties agreed to a principle that we call land swaps. It means that the border will be based on 67, but it will not be exactly as it was in 67, because Israel want to keep some of the settlement that are close to the border. So the idea, and here you can see, by the way, a map, many information leaked from this negotiation a few years ago by Al Jazeera, so we have a lot of information in the maps. So you can see that the main differences about this question of land swaps and borders was between less than 2%. This is what Abu Mazen and the Palestinians suggested, that this settlement will stay under Israeli sovereignty annexed to the Israeli side. In exchange for that, Israel will bring empty territories to the Palestinian side, especially here, and also here. But Olmert talked about 6% in order to keep more settlement that will be under Israeli sovereignty, and in exchange giving more areas, empty areas for the Palestinians. So that was eventually the main disagreement between 2% and 6%. Another important question was how to connect between the West Bank and Gaza. Now, of course, at that point, Abu Mazen had no control over Gaza, but the goal was that one day it will go back to be one entity, and then it need to be connected somehow. Now, the question is Jerusalem. It's a very complicated question. I did a lot of research on this issue where we can elaborate it more. I will just say very, very briefly that, first of all, the parties agreed in the question of neighborhood to accept what we call the Clinton formula, that the Jewish neighborhood will be under Israeli sovereignty, the Arab neighborhood will be under Palestinian sovereignty. But the main disagreement was about the old city, what we call the Holy Basin, and the holy sites. Again, the question of the sovereignty in the most important sites, the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, and Al-Aqsa Haram al-Sharif, the most contested place. That was the big disagreement. There were different creative ideas, maybe divine sovereignty, maybe international, that was the idea of Olmert, or maybe horizontal division. But this is a big challenge. And there was also the question if it will be physically divided or not, if it will stay as one entity or with open border. The question of refugees, again, a very, very complicated and sensitive issues, but in Annapolis, the parties agreed on some principles, that there will be an international commission that will deal with compensation, resettlement, and so on. And the Palestinian refugees, especially from Lebanon and Syria, will have a few options. They can go back to the Palestinian state that will create, to the areas in the land swaps. They can stay where they are. They can have third countries. But the main disagreement was about how many Palestinians will be able to go back inside Israel. Israel is, of course, against this idea, but this is the Palestinian symbolic right of return. So the discussion was about some symbolic numbers to show that there will be some Palestinians that can go back. Olmert was talking about 50,000. Of course, the Palestinian talked about a higher number, but that was the debate. And of course, Israel demanded that also the question of the Jewish refugees will be discussed, will be addressed. The Jewish refugees from Arab countries, from Muslim countries, and their lost property. This is an issue that also needs to be as part of this agreement. And of course, the question of security is a big concern from Israel, and actually Abu Mazen recognized that in the negotiation. The parties agreed that the state, the Palestinian state, would be a demilitarized state without an army, with limitation on the security issues, with some international presence, maybe NATO or other international actors. In Jordan Valley, there will be some special arrangement coordinated with Jordan, and of course, security cooperation and struggle against terrorism. And I will just say for conclusion, and again, next week, there will be much further discussion about this triangle of Israel, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority. But I will say that after Annapolis failed in 2009, Netanyahu was elected as the head of the Likud, and he is actually the prime minister until today, with a short break, as you probably remember, with the Lapid and Bennett, but all over the years it was Netanyahu. In the first years, the American administration, Obama administration, tried again to bring the parties to negotiate. If you remember, George Mitchell tried and John Kerry in 2014. But after that, it completely failed. And since 2014 until today, there have been no Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiation at all. Of course, I'm talking about Israel and the PA. Hamas is a different issue. And there have been no peace process. And I feel also this is an issue I've been working on a lot, but also the world a little bit gave up, felt that maybe there is no chance of trying again. We can see that the conditions are not right. There are all the problems that I mentioned, the division inside the Palestinian, the leaders are not ready. There are so many problems, security problems and others. So maybe we need to wait for something that the condition will be better. But we can see in the last years, there have been no peace process. I can say, by the way, personally, the difference between me and my students, I'm coming from the Oslo generation that everybody was talking about peace. It was the main discussion in the news, in the political discourse. There was always some kind of a peace negotiation. My students have no idea what I'm talking about. They haven't seen any kind of peace negotiation. They just saw the Abraham Accord, but no Israeli-Palestinian negotiation in the last year. So it's completely changed. And we can see also that the public support, both sides are completely not talking about peace, lost hope in this idea, the ideas that we tried and it failed. And also the support in the two-state solution is going down all during the last years. You can see here in the data, moving from majority to less than 50%. And if you will check that these days, it's even worse, it's even lower. And I would just say, and this is of course something that is still happening, that today we can see a lot of international diplomatic efforts. Blinken is coming here almost every week, trying to see how we can connect the issue of the post-war Gaza into maybe renewing the talks about some kind of a peace process between Israel and the PA, and trying also, and this is a very smart move, to connect it to the normalization issue with Saudis. But this is, of course, too soon to know. We are just in the middle of this process, but this is part of the question of the day after the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lior, for this very enlightening and very important presentation. I think that everyone can see that the issue is very complicated and the reality is very complicated. And I would like to dive right into the questions. We've had a number of questions being raised in the chat over the course of your presentation. So the first question is from Sarah Siegel, and she asks, from your perspective as a researcher of peace and the process of peace, is the possibility of peace in Israel more remote since October the 7th? Yes, no, why do you think that?
So this is in one of the biggest questions that we are asking ourselves today. I'm trying not to predict anything in general. I'm dealing with the past. Even the past is complicated to understand, but I'm trying not to talk about the future, especially in conflicts, because we can see that usually if you ask me a few months before the first Intifada, nobody thought it will happen. If you ask me a few months before Oslo, nobody thought it will happen. So a lot of development, also, by the way, in other places, in Northern Ireland, it's something that it's difficult to predict. But I would just say that we can see now two main conclusions. On the one hand, some people say after the atrocities and the tragic and the horrific events of October 7 and after the war, that some people are now saying we are losing hope, we can't see any hope for peace. So maybe that's one trend, one direction. But on the other hand, I think some people are saying that was maybe a mistake to try to ignore the question of the conflict, trying maybe to manage, maybe trying what conflict management between Netanyahu and Hamas. Maybe we can't hide it anymore. We need to go back to deal with this issue. And this is, we can, if you want some optimism, we can use the example of the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War. And that was, again, a very tragic event that had a trauma for the Israeli public. It was something that was a long implication on the public, but actually it changed a little bit the perception on both sides, and it led eventually, gradually, to a peacemaking process between Israel and Egypt, with Kissinger first. Now Martin Indyk published a great book about these years, and later, of course, with Carter, bringing a peace agreement with Israel and Egypt. Nobody thought in 73 that will happen, and this is part of the theory we call in the literature the ripeness theory, that sometimes you need to feel that you're in a mutual hurt and stalemate, and maybe to try to change course and to try perception and to try to move to a different direction. But it's very soon. It's too soon, I think, to guess.
Thank you very much. Our second question comes from Harley Frank, and he asks, would Oslo have been successful if the Israeli government had taken the time to reach out to the opposition from their input, so that they could have gotten a buy-in from the other side?
From the Israeli opposition?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when we are talking about Oslo, of course, it's a long process, and now there are many conclusions looking both on the Israeli domestic in the way that Oslo was managed, but also on the Palestinian side. I think there are different conclusions that we can reach. I think that back then it was very, very difficult between the coalition and the opposition. It was almost half-half during the Oslo years. But after that, you need to remember that Netanyahu got into power and Oslo actually continued. And Netanyahu actually signed a few other agreements during Oslo. So actually Oslo continued even when the Likud and the right wing got to power. And we saw that there were actually some factors in the right wing and also Shas, for example, a religious party, that actually supported the process. So if you will see the surveys during Netanyahu years and you will ask what do you think about Oslo, you had a much wider support. As I showed, there will be a majority that supported Oslo, part of them coming also from the right wing, but eventually it changed after the Intifada. I will just say that one of the conclusions of Oslo related also to the issue of secular and versus religious people. The idea was that it was a very secular process, and especially when we are talking about Jerusalem and holy sites, it's a little bit problematic that it was only the secular on both sides, on the Israeli and the Palestinian side, trying a little bit to exclude the religious actors, the religious public. And I think that part of the conclusion after Camp David failed is that you need to try to make a wider camp on both sides. You cannot exclude the religious, you cannot exclude some of the actors, and this is a discussion we have in the literature about inclusive peacemaking process. And I completely agree that if there will be a new peacemaking process, it must be much more inclusive, and to see how we can bring more actors, not just Barak and Arafat or just these two leaders. It needs to bring more and more actors into the process.
Thank you. Third question comes from Charles Stillman, and he asks, kind of short, is this the current illustration of the 100 Years' War that we're currently going through?
If these days.
Yeah.
I think usually I'm teaching the history of the conflict and also the history of the peace efforts in the Middle East. It's always a question that you have patterns of continuity, that we are talking about the Tarpat in 29, we are talking about the 30s, we are talking about 48, and we are talking about today, and many things seems like we are on the same ground, moving from one thing to another. But on the other hand, if you are looking carefully, you can also see a lot of patterns that completely change. If you remember, again, I'm teaching the conflict starting in the 48, 49, 40, 50s. Nobody was talking with Israel. Nobody recognized Israel. The first peace agreement took place only many, many years after that in 79. Now the situation is completely different. Israel is in a different place. Israel had good relation, or at least formal diplomatic relation with many Arab countries. And even with the Palestinian, you can see that you have agreements, still not a peace agreement, but you have with the PA, still even some kind, even though it's a very difficult situation right now, some kind of security cooperation, some kind of coordination that you can talk with. So it's not in the same situation that we had, for example, in Talpat, or when we have the Mufti, for example, in the 40s. So things change. And again, also with Egypt, nobody thought we can reach an agreement, and we had war 48 and 56 and 67 and 78. So many people have died. And now they're actually helping us try to negotiate with the Palestinians and try to help us in different ways. Of course, the very complex relation, but things are also changing. And now we are talking about the Saudis and so many other actors that we can have normalization. So things are also changed. But we have also, of course, the conflict that continues also with the Hezbollah and also with other actors. But at the same time, there are also progress in the question of cooperation and peacemaking. So to make it half optimistic, half pessimistic.
Let's see, our fourth question, it's actually a combined one. So at this point, who would be a viable candidate for a Palestinian administration in a post-war Gaza? And is there even a chance that the Palestinian public would go along with any agreement negotiated by the Palestinian Authority, if we're talking about that sphere?
Yeah, so this is another complicated question that we are dealing with for many years, but now I think Biden administration is trying to deal with it, what they are calling the Empower, the Revitalize PA. So it's important to say, first of all, that the PA, and next week you will talk about it more with Professor Jacobson, the PA became weaker and weaker over the years because people feel that they are not relevant anymore, and they are nothing, the Palestinians are not getting anything from the PA. Also the question of corrupt, but also a lot of criticism on the fact that Israel continued, that the PA continued this security coordination with Israel, but they are not getting anywhere. They're not moving to a state. It's stuck in the same situation. And also the fact that Abu Mazen was elected in 2005, and there have been no elections since then. Is not getting younger. So there is a need for a new leadership. But on the other hand, as I said, we have the two options. If you are not taking Hamas, you're not taking the PLO, you need to create a new PA that will have more legitimacy, but also will recognize Israel and will be able to work with Israel, not to create a new threat. So what we will see now is that there is a demand from the US, but also from the EU that are giving most of the money to the PA to try to make reforms, to make changes in the government, to have an election. But the question of election, of course, is very complex. We saw what happened the last election. So we need to see how we are going to have election, but only with actors that accept democracy, accept the issue of not using violence, but also changing some reforms in the PA to make sure that it's not just 2-3 people control the PA for so many years. You need to bring to make it much more democratized, much more democracy. But at the same time, it needs to be part of a wider process in order to have legitimacy. And this is what the Saudis and also the US is saying, to talk about some kind of talk about the horizon for the two-state solution, and then they will have also more legitimacy. But at the same time, also to talk about how exactly you will continue the security coordination and who exactly will control Gaza and what kind of mechanism, international forces, and so on.
And our last question relates to the West Bank, the map that you showed after the Oslo Accords. So who owned the gray areas reserved for settlements on the West Bank? Specifically, Bobby Wittes asks, when a new Jewish settlement is planned on the West Bank, do the settlers buy the land from the government of Israel? Is this land given for free? What exactly is the organization of this?
Yeah, so first we need to distinguish this the question of the political sovereignty or the political, these areas A, B, C, and the question of property and the ownership of the property. So this is the two separate questions. First, the question of the political status. All the settlement, all of them are under Area C. Actually, area C, it's all the area that it's not Palestinian city, it's not Palestinian villages. Now, what we have, it's all the rest is the settlement, and we can see the expansion of settlement as I saw. But there was some secret understanding between the US and the United States as a result of Oslo that Israel continued the expansion of settlement, but they are not going to build new settlement. What we have actually since 2000 is more and more what we call the illegal outposts, that it's actually illegal settlement even in the Israeli law. And we have more and more of them. And in 2003, there was the roadmap during the Bush administration that Israel actually talked about evacuating of this area. And this area, just people are getting into these places and they're also expanding them without any permission, without any legal process. But they are still there. And as you can see, especially with this government, they are also trying to legalize them. But you can see that in these cases, I'm not talking about the big settlement that were built over the years by especially the big cities, especially the areas that are closer to the border, like Ma'ale Adumim, by the government in a very clear process. Now what we have is very, very small illegal outposts that were actually created without any legal process, but they are still there. They're also getting electricity and water. And this is an issue that was discussed all over the years between the US and Israel, but they are still there. And especially under this government, nobody's talking about changing the situation there, but it was without any legal process of exactly buying the land. Sometimes there isn't even going to court because some part of it is a Palestinian property. But again, it happened, it took place without any legal process. So we still have this problem that need to be addressed.
Thank you very much. This again portrays how complicated the situation is. We have a few more questions, but I don't think we have a lot of time. We don't have too much time to ask all of them. So for those of you who are interested in asking some more, you can send us the questions and we'll try our best to bring them to Dr. Lers and answer them as much as we can. So Dr. Lers, I want to thank you very much for giving us the time and your expertise about this issue. And really for enlightening us and opening our eyes about presenting how difficult, like we said, the situation is. I would like to also take this opportunity to remind everyone about next week's seminar with Professor Abigail Jacobson, where she is going to delve into the development of Hamas in light of its relationship with Israel and with the Palestinian Authority. It's going to be a fascinating webinar touching on one of the most important or most interesting issues at the moment that we're facing, speaking about Hamas specifically. And also, I would like to tell you, for those of you who don't know, the Hebrew University has a We Are One campaign. It's a campaign we started to help our student community and the community of Hebrew University at this time. Many of them are either still in reserves or coming back from reserves, and we have a lot of needs that need to be met with them. If it's even for scholarships, if it's even for academic assistance, psychological counseling, emergency aid, for the students who are still in reserves or those who came back from reserves, we have a link that we put in the chat. Feel free to go to the link for more information. Any help, any donation, anything you can do helps. This goes to our Dean of Students, and he helps us allocate the donations where the need is the highest. So please go to the website, to the link, and you can see here how you can help us at this time. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, I want to thank Dr. Lers for your time, and stay tuned for our next week's webinar. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Shai.
Thank you.